One of the things that has not been able to be achieved yet is a consensus between the administration and Congress on tackling the big elephant in the room, which is deficit reduction, in a way that will solve the problem into the years. We've got a $17.5 trillion deficit, projected to go back to $1 trillion a year in the next few years. And OMB plays a critical role for the administration, but also for the country. So my first question is, I've worked very closely with GAO. I recommended that you spend time with GAO. When you see the last 4 years' reports from GAO on duplication, and by the way, the administration has done a fairly good job at outlining some of those things in the annual budgets. What's your level of frustration when you see that, according to my staff's calculation, we've got about $250 billion a year in duplication with minimal metrics outlined by the GAO? What's the position within the administration in terms of addressing that, in terms of the real leadership of asking Congress fix this?
Well, Senator, you and I spoke a little bit about this, and it is an area where I think we have made some real progress. Just to give you one example, the President's budget for 2015 outlines about 130 programs where we can achieve cuts, consolidations, other types of savings for a total of about $17 billion. Certainly my experience at HUD has been that there's a lot that we can do. One of the primary areas I focused on as soon as I arrived, we have 13 different rental assistance programs at HUD, and some of that makes sense. We have a program for seniors, a program for people with disabilities that have, logical differences, but too often those differences are just history and circumstance rather than being logical. So I started an effort called the Rental Assistance Demonstration, which is already about 2/3 of the way consolidating older, frankly obsolete programs into a single program, and we've been working with Congress, and in fact in our Senate budget, Senator Collins really should get some credit for this. We've been able to start to consolidate about 1/5 of all public housing into the Section 8 program. And so I think there is more work that we can do with executive authority. To be frank, Senator, I think too often what is hard is achieving bipartisan consensus about whether it's reducing the number of offices that we have around the country or reducing programs. And so I do think we need to find ways, and I'd love to talk to you further about it, get suggestions on ways that we could drive not just ideas about consolidation, but get to actual bipartisan consensus where we can achieve legislative reforms, both in the budget and otherwise as well.
My understanding is OMB has the power to require agencies to put metrics on programs. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do, and in fact, I would compliment the committee that JIPRA modernization has been a very important tool. I'm a particularly big believer, referencing something I said earlier, in cross-agency goals. Right. That's the reason we've been able to achieve such success on veterans homelessness, is because we built a data system that was shared between HUD and the Veterans Administration, and we meet on a very regular basis with the most senior leadership to really look at the progress we're achieving, not just nationally, but place by place, to see what's working and what isn't.
But the way to find out if things are working is have metrics on the things which you testified in your opening statement.
Absolutely.
And we agree with that. So I guess my question for you is, are you committed to trying to implement that across the government through both the GIPRA Modernization Act as well as your authority as OMB director? Because you can't, if you can't measure these programs, you can't manage them effectively, and we won't know. And that's one of GAO's biggest recommendations, is there's no metrics on most of the programs. We don't know what we're doing.
I couldn't agree more, and in fact, not just in the last 5.5 years, but my 5 years working under Mayor Bloomberg in New York. As you know, the CompStat process was started at the police department in New York City, and I created both in my agency in New York and here at at HUD an Office of Strategic Planning and Management whose specific responsibility it was to create and track those metrics across the most critical programs, and frankly to do process improvement work as well, because it's one thing to identify the problem, you then got to fix it. Yeah. And having the capacity to actually have a team that can go in almost like an internal consultant within the agency to do that, I think is absolutely critical. And so I think that's, to be frank, you know, many people, this is not an area that they think is one of the most interesting or sort of most noteworthy around government. I'm not only interested in doing this, I'm actually passionate about it, and I drive my team crazy at HUD in terms of my wanting to understand the numbers.
Congress and this committee recently passed the Data Act, and it has some deference to the Defense Department. It gives them some extra time, but one of the things that's going to be required for that is the head of OMB to keep the commitment that we're going to meet the goals of that legislation. Will you state before this committee that you will do everything in your power to keep the commitment that the Data Act timelines are fulfilled?
Senator, I am committed to working with you very closely to make sure that we can achieve those goals of the Data Act. I'm getting up to speed on this. I know there was lots of bipartisan work on that bill. I know that OMB is currently trying to understand with agencies what system changes, what investments are going to be required. So you have my commitment to come back very quickly if I'm confirmed and work with you to meet those timelines.
Right. You just made a statement that shows what kind of trouble we're in. The agencies don't have that information now to comply with the Data Act. And the very fact that they have to get up to speed to comply tells you that they don't know what they're doing in terms of management, because they don't know where they're spending the money. You know, this is a pretty straightforward, where'd you spend your money? It's a pretty straightforward bill. And the very fact across the government, agencies don't know where they're spending their money and don't aggregate those to look at it so that they can comply with the Data Act is the very reason we wanted the Data Act in the first place, is to force that consolidation of data so that they'll actually know what they're doing and where they're spending the money. In your statement, you mentioned investing in our economy. How would you reconcile additional spending with the need for additional deficit reduction, given the fact that CBO has a point line mainly based on entitlement programs and mandatory programs? How do you, in your own mind, outside of what the administration policy would be, in your own mind, how do you reconcile those two positions?
Yep. Senator, I think about this in terms of the work that I've done on housing, which is obviously one of the most significant drivers of our economy. What we have to do, and at times it can be a difficult balance, but it's absolutely critical. There are critical functions that we need to invest in. We have not just a fiscal deficit, we have deficits in our infrastructure, we have deficits in our educational system, we have deficits in the investments we're making in research and development, which we know contribute in the long run to the economic competitiveness of our country and ultimately to economic growth. We have to find ways to invest in those critical things, while at the same time dealing with what are really, as I mentioned in my statement, the two primary drivers of our long-term deficits. Our healthcare costs have grown more quickly than we've been able to control in our budget, and at the same time, we have a wave, the baby boom generation, that will be adding to, given the commitments we have to seniors, to those long-term costs. And so we have to find a bipartisan way to make those critical investments in the medium term, while at the same time dealing with those long-term drivers of the deficit.
Okay, I'm past my time. Go, Senator.